Presentation will be on the physical demands of running, specifically the kinematics and the kinetics. We won't really talk about the energy system demands that will be preserved for additional presentations. As an orthopedic and sports physical therapist, I see a lot of individuals that are trying to return to running after injury. As such, I've come across the question of what are the physical demands of running? If we're going to get someone back to it, then we need to ensure that our interventions and our process are sufficient to be able to get the patients and the athletes and the clients back to a sufficient amount of physical capacity such that they can endure the physical demands of running. That being said, these physical demands have otherwise been to some extent elusive. And so I want to put together a series that will better clarify what are the physical demands and what are the standards and thresholds that we need to get someone back to in order to endure such a wonderful event and task such as running. Okay, so I think it's important to first ask the question, like, what are the incidence and the prevalence of running-related injuries? So a systematic review in 2021 looked at the incidence and prevalence of all the different musculoskeletal injuries that can be accrued due to the task of running. And they've broken it up and dichotomized it into ultramarathoners and non-ultramarathoners. The I's indicate incidence, the P's indicate the prevalence, and then the specific locations along the body are where the highest incidence or lowest incidence and the highest prevalence and lowest prevalence are shown. So overall, the prevalence, that is at any one given time, almost 40% of runners, that is conglomerate and aggregate of both of these groups, would accrue up to 40% of individuals are either nursing or dealing with a running related injury. Within a given annual year, about 45% of runners can accrue some form of musculoskeletal injury, with the highest point prevalence being around the patellofemoral joint, that is the knee, closely followed by the Achilles tendinopathy, and then the foot and the ankle, which we could classify into medial tibial stress syndrome or shin splints, also known. And so taking this into account, it's clear that there's an issue. As a healthcare provider and sports medicine professional, my goal is to try and mitigate both of these statistics, the prevalence as well as the incidence, and help people back to pain-free and unencumbered running. So a common saying that is out there is that we need to be fit to run rather than run to get fit. But the elusive question is, how fit do we need to be, and what are the physical demands of running on the musculoskeletal system such that we can mitigate both the prevalence and the incidence of running-related injuries? So let's dive into it. So let's take each of the body regions in turn, particularly for the lower quarter, because that is, as we saw on the diagram previously, are where the majority of the injuries are accrued. And so I want to start with some of the seminal studies. There's two of them specifically that have helped us to identify the physical demands of running. The first of these seminal articles is Dorn et al. In 2012. Again, slightly dated, but it is such a seminal study that it stands the test of time. So their purpose was to describe and explain synergistic actions of the individual leg muscles over a wide range of running speeds, from slow to maximal sprinting. Though it is a small cohort of only 9 individuals, both males and females, almost 50-50 split between the genders, because it was done on such a granular level, that is the outcomes and the metrics that they took were so specific that it really does help to give us some insight, again, with the necessity for additional extrapolations. But studies since this have found comparable metrics and outcomes, despite the small cohort here. So the running speeds, again, they went from 3.5 all the way up to greater than 8.0 meters per second. For those that are more familiar with the English units, that's 7.8 all the way up to 20 miles per hour, which is a full-on sprint. So they use timing gates, a 3D motion capture system via Vicon. They looked at the ground reaction forces, which is the amount of force that someone puts into the ground, and they did so with in-ground force plates. So I've taken the liberties of taking the results and graphing it because I think it's more powerful in the visual. So if you had to project the muscle groups that are most in demand or most stressed with running, most people would either suggest the major muscle groups of the thigh, that is the quad or the hamstring, and even maybe perhaps the hip muscles of the glute. But the reality is that the workhorse is the soleus and the gastroc, that is your calf muscles. And you can see that indicated here. On the y-axis, you have your peak force in body weights, and then you have the different running speeds that they've looked at. So for those who may not be familiar, these are like times of body weight. So if you looked at 7.8 miles per hour, and I've provided the statistical values there, so you can see that the quadriceps produces 4.7 body weights for every step that the individual takes. That being said, the soleus is at 6.7 times body weight. Not only is that more, but when you look at the the size and the cross-sectional area of these muscles, you don't need a medical degree to understand that the people's thighs and quadriceps are significantly thicker than that of the soleus and or the calf muscles. Thus, they are working at a higher capacity, not only relative to the muscle size, but also a net significant difference and higher. And you can see that there's a gradual increase in the soleus demand up to 14 or almost 15 miles per hour. It then does drop off because the amount of time that the foot is on the ground is shorter as you get faster and faster into sprinting, and thus the muscle doesn't have the opportunity to really be able to contract with as much force because of the small time interval. And what we will see in the coming slides is that the hip muscles actually take over as someone crests from what is a very fast jog, we'll call it, up to a sprint. But the take-home message is that the major muscle groups and players are certainly the quadriceps, but not to be overshined by the calf muscles, that is the gastroc and the soleus, with the soleus being significantly higher work demands than either of the other two muscles. And then this is what I was describing with the time intervals that the foot is on the ground. So they're producing these forces in fractions of a second. So what I've done here is I've just divided those body weights per second. So instead of just looking at the strength, we're looking at power. Power is being defined as force over time. So when we take that into account, we can see that they're producing multiple body weights per second, exponentially more than what we saw in the previous slide. And when we take that into account, again, you see kind of a leveling off of the soleus and the gastroc as you get into those faster running speeds. And when you're looking at peak force for the swing phase, that is the non-stance limb, what we can see is that there's an exponential increase in two major muscle groups, and that's going to be your iliopsoas. People also know this as a hip flexor, and then also your hamstrings. Once again, we can see exponential increase in the number of body weights. So depending on how heavy someone weighs, that would be an indication of that they're, even at a low jogging speed, that these muscles are working at close to 2 times, if not 3 times body weight. And that exponentially gets up to almost 9 times body weight during the swing phase of sprinting. And you can see that there's a jump in their activation as you get into that faster sprint, which again takes over and helps to produce the power when the gastroc and the soleus and the stance muscles are having a smaller interval of time to be able to produce their force. So the figures here look at the stride length as well as the stance time over the different running speeds. So on the y-axis, you have either how far they're striding and or the stance time. And then on the x-axis, you have the different running speeds over time. So if we take the first graph, we can see that stride length significantly increases as we get up to, again, around 7 meters per second, and then it somewhat tapers off just because you can't, there's going to be limited, essentially a ceiling effect there, but the actual stride frequency continues to increase and takes over for the stride length once that is maximized. And then in the time graph that we see on the bottom, where we're looking at the ground contact time, the black line, we can see, as I alluded to, there's almost like a linear decrease in how long the foot is on the ground. But there's also an aerial time that continues to increase up to that 7 meters per second. Where the effective vertical ground impulse, how much force they're putting down into the ground, again, continues to be able to kind of increase up to your 7 meters per second and then somewhat tapers off. And so because of the bottleneck, which is how short of a time interval that the foot is on the ground, we then can see the compensation by the 25% increase as people start to spin their wheels faster with higher frequency of steps. So for speeds less than 7 meters per second, the plantar flexors and soleus contribute most significantly to the vertical support force, hence an increase in stride length. And then speeds greater than 7 meters per second, these muscles shorten at relatively high velocities, and that has less time to generate the forces needed to support the body. And thus, greater than 7 meters per second, the strategy used to increase running speeds shifts from the goal of stride frequency once that stride length has been maximized. The hip muscles, primarily the iliopsoas, glute max, and hamstrings, achieve the goal of going faster once we accelerate beyond that 7 meters per second. So the second seminal article is by Hamner and Scott Delp, and they looked at the muscle contributions of fore and aft and vertical body mass center accelerations over a range of running speeds in 2013. Again, slightly dated, but given how rigorous and how influential their work with, it still has stand the test of time. And it's, again, the purpose was to examine how muscles generate acceleration of the body center of mass. Again, they had a comparable cohort relative to the Dorn article. Their conditions, they used 3D muscle-driven simulation of running. They had different speeds, 4 of them comparable, again, to the Dorn article, with the exception that their speeds were slightly lower. They didn't go all the way up to sprinting. They did 7 mid to rear foot strikers, the 3 forefoot strikers at all running speeds. And then they used comparable Vicon 3D motion capture systems and OpenSim. Their difference here, obviously, that they had EMG activation electrodes on 10 different muscles. So talking about the ground reaction forces, so this would be the aggregate ground reaction force of a single step during someone's stride. On the x-axis is time, on the y-axis is the acceleration, and the length of the lines that you see indicate the intensity or the magnitude of the ground reaction force. That is the amount of force that is put into the ground and that is hitting back at the body. And then the direction of the lines indicate whether that's braking force. So if it's pointing to the left, those are braking vectors, meaning that they're working in front of the center of mass. And then the angled lines that are pointing to the right indicate that they are accelerating the body forward and acting behind the center of mass. And you can see that on the whole, as an aggregate, that there are a slightly leaning bias of the greatest magnitude or vectors that are pointing slightly into a braking force, but for the most part, they translate the center of mass forward over time aggregately. And so if we break this down further, let's look at what muscles contribute to the acceleration or hitting behind the center of mass, pushing it into an acceleration into the next step. And we can see that at almost all time points, the gastroc and the soleus, as shown there, respectively, soleus on the left, gastroc on the right, indicates that these are, again, the workhorse. They are pushing the center of mass forward. The quadriceps, on the other hand, are working as in a braking fashion. They are absorbing force, and the fact that they're all vectors are pointing to the left indicate that they are braking. They are hitting in front. They are working against the forward progression of the center of mass of running, as if someone is running from the left to the right hand portion of the screen. You can also appreciate, once again, the amplitude. Again, I've tried to position it to scale to some extent, at least between the gastroc and the quadriceps. But then look at the exponential scale. It's almost 10x for the soleus. And then the glutes, again, this is disproportionate, not to scale because of the 1 to 0. And what we see here is that the glutes have pretty much more of a vertical element to them compared to the bias of the acceleration of the calf and the braking forces of the quadriceps. And this is, this starts to get at the demands of running and how important it is for these muscles to be strong in the muscle function that they work in during the running, meaning that we need really strong eccentric control with our quadriceps. That means they need to be really good at absorbing force, whereas the concentric, the force production during the muscle shortening of our calves is really important for the speed and the power of running. And I highlight again, the 10x scaled soleus there. So in the early stance phase, the quadriceps group are the largest contributor to the backward and upward mass center acceleration in each step. In late stance, the ankle plantar flexors, soleus and gastroc, were the main contributors to forward and upward center of mass acceleration. Again, the soleus is a dominant contributor to the increase to the vertical and to the forward center of mass acceleration at all running speeds. Large mass center essentially accelerates from the soleus, occurs because of the muscles produces a large force and is uniarticular at the ankle, versus the gastroc is dual. It works both at the knee and at the ankle, and because it works secondarily as a knee flexor, its capacity to accelerate the center of mass forward is somewhat dampened. And here's a proportionate visual of what I kind of showed on the last screen. We have vertical acceleration on the y-axis, and we have the different muscle groups shown on the x. Once again, it's like almost 10x what we see from the soleus contribution compared to any other muscle at any one running speed. And then we have the horizontal ground reaction force. So if we take a moment just to understand the diagram. So 0 is essentially no movement. And then anything that's to the left and pointing backwards, similar to the vector lines that we saw in 2 slides back, indicates that these muscles are working in a braking fashion. They're working against our forward progression, as if the individual, as shown there by the small diagram, is running from the left to the right hand portion of the screen. And then anything to the right of the 0 are indicating that it's moving the center of mass forward. So it's really showing the horizontal vectors. So the forward acceleration force of plantar flexors was greater than the total forward center of mass acceleration, where the quad continues to accelerate the center of mass backwards against the propulsion. So not only does the soleus have to move us forward, but it's got to overcome the vector of the vastus lateralis and the quadriceps. And you can see the gastroc and the soleus demonstrated there as they are propelling the center of mass forward. And then I provided the specific numerical values as well. And then this is the velocity at which someone is running. You can see the different shades indicating the different running speeds. And again, at any one given time point, the soleus and the gastroc contributions have to be greater than that of the velocity forward, from the standpoint that they have to overcome the negative work and the braking forces of the other muscle groups. And this has really big implications and why quadricep strength and the larger major contributors at the hip and at the thigh are so important when we do strength testing in preparation for someone's return to running. And we'll continue to explore the demands of running for each individual joint moving forward. But I think that these two studies combined really give us a high-level overview and a really in-depth analysis as to what the muscle contributions are and what their demands need to be in order to be successful at this task. So this is a modified slide from Dr. Rich Willey. He's a profound giant in the field of running and specializes in bone stress injuries. He has a wonderful Instagram. If you don't follow him, I strongly encourage it. But he does some excellent visuals with his slide deck, and I've modified this from one of the slides that he has previously presented. So kudos to him. And then I've cited the source that he cited as well for the information. So one of the reasons why knees get are such challenged with running, we saw the incidence and the prevalence earlier in the video, and that is the highest point of musculoskeletal complaints in running related injuries, is the exponential increase in force that comes between walking and running at the joint. So when we are walking, we need 5.5 body weights with every step at our hip. For our patellofemoral contact forces, it's like 1.1, and then our Achilles tendon forces are like 3.4 times body weight. And then running, at least at 7.5 miles per hour, this would obviously, as we saw, increase as we increase in speed, but we get about a 1.8x increase at the hip, but we get a 4.6 times increase at the knee. Where our patellofemoral contact forces jump from 1 to 5. And then the peak Achilles tendon force, again, this being the conduit by which the gastroc soleus is able to produce its forward acceleration, increases by comparable to that of the hip. So the joint that is most responsible, it takes the greatest impact, and I really do believe it's because of the braking forces and the shock absorption, the energy absorption that the quadriceps and the knee have to do with running, takes a much larger exponential impact when we transition from walking to running. Okay, so that wraps up this part one of this series on looking at the demands of running. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, I certainly will happy to field those. Leave them in the comments section below. Thanks so much.